I'm going to read a couple more chapters of our Read Aloud book, Flora and Ulysses by Kate DeCamillo. And I just want to talk about where we left off. We read only chapter 1, and we left off with Flora's next door neighbor and using their, what do they call this, vacuum? It's basically a vacuum. Oh yeah, the super section, Ulysses super section 2000X. And it's so powerful that it drug her neighbor outside, and they are about to get the squirrel vacuumed up. Well, it did happen. All right, here we go. Chapter 2, The Mind of a Squirrel. Not much goes on in the mind of a squirrel. Huge portions of what is loosely termed the squirrel brain are given over to one thought: food. The average squirrel cognition goes something like this: I wonder what there is to eat. This thought is then represented with small variations of, where's the food? Man, I sure am hungry. Is that a piece of food? And are those more pieces of food? Some 6,000 or 7,000 times a day. So basically what she's saying is that the only thing squirrels think about is food. All of this is to say that when the squirrel in the Tickman's backyard got swallowed up by the Ulysses 2000X, there weren't a lot of terribly profound thoughts going through his head. As the vacuum cleaner roared toward him, he did not, for instance, think, here, at last is my fate come to meet me. He did not think, oh, please give me one more chance and I will be good. What he thought was, man, I sure am hungry. And then there was a terrible roar, and he was sucked right off his feet. At that point, there were no thoughts on his squirrel head, not even thoughts of food. Chapter 3, The Death of a Squirrel. Seemingly, swallowing a squirrel was a bit much even for the powerful, indomitable, indoor-outdoor of Ulysses 2000X. Miss Tickham's birthday machine let out an uncertain roar and stuttered to a stop. Miss Tickham's bent over and looked down at the vacuum cleaner. There was a tail sticking out of it. For heaven's sake, she said, what's next? She dropped to her knees and gave the tail a tentative tug. She stood. She looked toward the yard. Help, she said. I think I've killed a squirrel. Chapter 4. A surprisingly helpful cynic. Flora ran from her room. She ran down the stairs. As she ran, she thought, for a cynic, I am a surprisingly helpful person. She went out the back door. Her mother called to her. She said, where are you going, Flora Belle? Flora didn't answer. She never answered her mother when she called her Flora Belle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and the Tickhams in a single bound. Move out of the way, said Flora. She gave Miss Tickham a shove and grabbed hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and shook it. Nothing happened. She shook harder. The squirrel dropped out of the vacuum cleaner and landed with a plop on the grass. Here's the scene right here. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur. Vacuumed off, Flora assumed. His eyelids fluttered. His chest rose and fell and rose again. And then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt. She put a finger on the squirrel's chest. At the back of each issue of the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesco, there was a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's very favorite bonus comics was entitled, Terrible Things Can Happen to You. As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. I keep using the word cynic. It kind of means that she is negative and just very skeptical of everything and everyone around her, but mostly negative. As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. Who knew what horrible, unpredictable thing would happen next? Terrible Things Can Happen to You detailed what action to take if you inadvertently consumed plastic fruit. This happened more often than you would suppose. Some plastic fruit was extremely realistic looking. How to perform the Heimlich maneuver on your elderly Aunt Edith if she choked on a stringy piece of steak at an all-you-can-eat buffet. What to do if you were wearing a striped shirt and a swarm of locusts descended. Run. Locusts eat stripes. And of course, how to administer everyone's favorite life-saving technique, CPR. Terrible things can happen to you did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. I'll figure it out, said Flora. What will you figure out, said Mrs. Tickum. Flora didn't answer. Instead, she bent down and put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. Ew, it tasted funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say that it tasted exactly like squirrel, fuzzy, damp, and slightly nutty. Have you lost your mind, said Mrs. Tickum. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth. She pushed down on his small chest. She started to count. Chapter 5. The Squirrel Obliges. Something strange had happened to the squirrel's brain. Things had gone black, and then, into this blankness, there came a light so beautiful, so bright, that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. What's that? Said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. Okay, said the squirrel, you bet. He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. The squirrel heard another noise. The voice was counting. The light receded. Breathe, the new voice shouted. The squirrel obliged. That means he did it. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another and another. The squirrel returned. Chapter 6. In the Event of a Seizure. Well, he's breathing, said Mrs. Tickum. Yes, said Flora, he is. She felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach. He raised his head. His eyes were glazed. For heaven's sake, said Miss Tickum, look at him. She chuckled quietly. She shook her head, and then she laughed out loud. She kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard she started to shake. Was she having some kind of a fit? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilizing it with a stick or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason she couldn't save Miss Tickum's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky. Mrs. Tickum continued to laugh hysterically. And Flora Belle Buckman started looking around the Tickums' backyard for a stick. All right, Chapter 7, The Soul of a Squirrel. The squirrel was a little unsteady on his feet. His brain felt larger, roomier. It was as if several doors in the dark room of his self, doors he hadn't even known existed, had suddenly been flung wide. Everything was shot through with meaning, purpose, light. However, the squirrel was still a squirrel, and he was hungry. Very. Oh no. So here's the squirrel approaching the vacuum again. Who can say what astonishments are hidden inside the most mundane being? Now here's the squirrel holding up the vacuum and shaking it. And it looks like the squirrel has found some food. All right, we're going to stop there. I read quite a few chapters. We're going to leave off on Chapter 8. So I hope you're enjoying this story, and stay tuned for the next read aloud.